Welcome to the Reality Taboo, where no topic is off limits. It's May 2nd, 2025, and I'll be journeying solo today. Peaceful Rest Valley is more straightforward than Moonside, the issues with the pencil eraser aside. And so it would seem to make sense that I tackle a topic that is more straightforward and less convoluted and complicated, not a topic that has flummoxed me for the better part of the last 2 decades if I'm journeying alone. One would think anyway, but that's not going to be the case here. I'm going to bury the lead here with the first topic that we're going to look at, but bear with me, it will one major pillar buttressing the broader point, the broader observation that I'd like to make and discuss and potentially hypothesize about how things could have gone in a different direction and how they might still go in a different direction. Hopefully that's a little tantalizing, though the information we're going to discuss here is interesting on its own, and that is an evaluation of pro-immigration sentiment by religious affiliation in the United States. To assess this, we're turning to the General Social Survey, the GSS, which has run continuous about religious affiliation for the duration of the survey and about how Americans feel about immigration into the United States since the turn of the century. So for the last 25 years, the General Social Survey has asked both about religious affiliation and if, quote, do you think the number of immigrants to America nowadays should be ... unquote, with the answers potentially being increased a lot, increased a little, remain the same as it is, reduced a little, or reduced a lot. And so to cross-reference religious affiliation with immigration sentiments, I created a pretty simple equation to arrive at a net immigration sentiment figure by religious affiliation. And to arrive at that figure, I multiplied the percentages who wanted to see immigration increased a lot by 2, added to it the percentages who wanted to see it increased a little, subtracted from that the percentages who wanted to see it decreased a little, and subtracted from that times 2 the percentages who wanted to see it decreased a lot. So effectively, we're looking at how groups on average as a whole feel towards immigration into America, whether they want it to be increased, in which case the net sentiment figure is positive, or if they want it decreased, in which case it's negative, and there is a double weighting for those who say they want it increased a lot or decreased a lot relative to increased a little or decreased a little. That might come across as a little bit tedious to go into that kind of detail as to how this little index is being calculated, but this is the largest, broadest, longest ranging survey of general American social attitudes in existence. And the benefit of a survey like this is that it asks a huge battery of questions and then allows users of the data to cross-reference those answers. But there is no specific subject being targeted by the survey. Oftentimes with political polling, there is a certain question that pollsters want to get an answer about, or more nefariously, that they want to try to sculpt general public sentiment in a certain direction to favor something they favor or those funding them favor, or to oppose something that they or their supporters think needs opposing. And so when those single issue polls are commissioned, it is easy to grease the skids so the thing goes in the direction you want it to go. To take a hypothetical about a subject germane to what we're going to be discussing here, you could commission a poll that asks respondents, quote, do you think it is important that the United States enforces its laws, including laws pertaining to immigration into the United States, unquote. To a survey question like that, the response will be overwhelmingly in favor of enforcing the nation's immigration laws. But if instead the question is worded something along the lines of, quote, do you favor mass deportations of people who are here and have otherwise behaved themselves and been productive members of American society when there are so many other more serious problems the country is facing, unquote. word it like that, and the result will be the opposite. There will be overwhelming opposition to undertaking that sort of mass deportation effort, even though the laws on the books say that the response by the federal government should be the same in each case. But because the GSS is conducted every couple of years and the questions need to be consistent and neutral over time, on account of the sheer number of questions and the corresponding respondent fatigue and frustration that is potentially generated by heavily loaded, not necessarily straightforward or transparent questions, because those kinds of loaded leading questions can corrupt the entire enterprise. The General Social Survey exists to assess the social sentiments of the American public, not to intentionally push public policy in a certain direction or create sensationalist headlines. To the contrary, for how valuable and longstanding the resource is, the GSS is woefully underutilized. And so let's make a small effort to rectify that by looking at net pro-immigration sentiment by religious affiliation right now. So in order from the religion whose members are the most supportive of increased immigration to those least supportive of it. Starting at the top, Islam. Muslims in America are the most supportive religious tradition with a 42.8 positive net immigration sentiment score. They're followed by Hindus at 22.7, and then by Buddhists at 21.8. Those are the only three religious groups with a positive immigration sentiment score. And while Islam and Hinduism are both growing quite rapidly in the United States, their numbers combined, and with Buddhists added in, still represent just 3%, a hair over 3% of the total American population. Muslims are 1.2%, Hindus 0.9%, and Buddhists 1.1%. So fewer than 1 in 30 Americans fall into one of these three religious traditions that are wildly more pro-immigration than the rest of America is. And so, continuing to move through the list, next we have Jews with a net immigration sentiment score of negative 3.3. After Jews are those who are irreligious, who have no religious affiliation whatsoever, coming in at a negative 8.8 points. Then we jump significantly to Catholics with a negative 30.3 score. And finally, by far the most immigration restrictionist religious tradition broadly defined in America are Protestants at negative 61.1. So Muslims, Hindus, and Buddhists in America are wildly pro-immigration. Jews and the irreligious are more middling in their sentiments, and Christians, Catholics, and especially Protestants, but Christians in general, are the most immigration restrictionist of the religious traditions in the United States. And though it will not so subtly hint at what the broader topic of the episode is, it is worth noting that even most Jews in the United States want to see immigration curtailed. And among Americans as a whole, that is overwhelmingly the sentiment. If we run this same formula for the entire population, we get a net immigration sentiment score of negative 37.2. Again, though Muslims and Buddhists and Hindus, in the case of Muslims and Hindus, because they have a very familial and cultural set of reasons to support immigration into the United States, because those who stand to benefit from immigration into the United States are their very family members and friends and relatives and people who share a culture and a language and a worldview with them, a religion with them, that the vast majority of Native Americans, not American Indians, but Americans who are native to America, who call this place home and hope that their great-grandkids do as well. And in the case of Buddhists, there is some of that as well. There is also a significant share of the Buddhist population in America who are European by ancestry, but who politically identify as very politically liberal. Famous celebrity examples of this phenomenon are people like Richard Gere and Orlando Bloom, Sharon Stone, Steven Seagal, Keanu Reeves. How deep and wide their knowledge and understanding of Buddhism may or may not be. Claiming adherence carries a cultural cachet, not dissimilar to the cultural cachet that is carried by expressing support for helping immigrants into the United States and welcoming all of the world, the wretched, huddled masses onto American shores, as long as those shores aren't literally the shores of, say, Martha's Vineyard or the Hollywood Hills. They, along with the often recently arrived Muslim and Hindu populations residing in America, only constitute 1/30 of the broader population. A broader population that very much expresses a desire for immigration to be curtailed drastically. Even a majority of Jews feel that immigration should not be increased and needs to be gotten under control. And yet it doesn't happen because no matter who Americans vote for, they always get John McCain. There are too many economic and cultural and political reasons that the neoliberal establishment wants a continual flow of immigration from outside the West into the Western world for it to be stopped. It is with little happiness that we point out our cynical prediction that after the first couple weeks of the incoming second Trump administration's honeymoon period, that the deportation push would fade away and get lost in the sauce of retail politics, and that is exactly what has happened. There is no longer even the Department of Homeland Security, or ICE, that had been in the first few days of the Trump administration. The second Trump administration had been providing daily updates on the number of deportations that it affected. That has gone away, and as it turns out, the number of deportations that the second Trump administration is affecting on a daily basis is number of deportations that were occurring under the Biden administration. It's meet the old boss, same as the new boss when it comes to the demographic transformation of America. If instead of religious affiliation, stated religious affiliation, we instead look at theistic orientation, that is, not just does a respondent report whatever religious tradition he was brought up in or he has some cultural affinity for, even though he doesn't put much stake in his faith if he ever thinks about it at all. We'll look at responses among atheists, agnostics, uncertain believers, and firm believers, irrespective of what their stated religious affiliations are. The only one of these four major theistic categories with a pro-immigration bent are atheists, who come in at plus 8.1. Agnostics are next at negative 13.0. Uncertain believers follow them at negative 34.2, and the most restrictionist theistic group are those who are firm believers. Those are to distinguish from uncertain believers who say that they struggle with their faith, or that they believe sometimes but sometimes they don't, or that they think there is some sort of higher power but they're unsure of exactly the nature of that power. Firm believers are those who in the GSS say that they, quote, know God exists, unquote. And that is K-N-O-W, know God exists, not N-O, know God exists. It's emphatic when you read it, even if it is a little bit confusing when it is articulated audibly. So if we recall previously, Protestants are the most immigration restrictionist of the religious traditions in America, and people who firmly believe in God are the most immigration restrictionist of all. And since Protestants who believe are evangelical Christians, and Christians who don't are mainline Protestants, it's those cursed evangelicals who are the most immigration restrictionists by a long shot. It doesn't make much difference, though, how often people attend religious services in terms of understanding how pro-immigration or pro-restrictionist they are, excluding agnostics and atheists and just looking at those who profess a belief in God of some sort. Those who attend services less than monthly, all the way from not at all to less often than once a month, the immigration sentiment is a negative 45.8 compared to those who attend weekly or more. So 52 times a year on up, the immigration sentiment is a negative 47.2. And so there's almost no difference there. Those who attend services regularly are marginally more immigration restrictionist than those who never go to church, but the differences are very minor. Much more predictive than how often someone goes to church is what religious affiliation they have and if they are certain in their belief of a higher power or not. It's easy to focus on the pastors and priests who are pushing messages from the pulpits about the need to take in immigrants from all over the world as a sort of moral onus on the community of believers. But there are plenty of sound Christian reasons to do the opposite. God wanted there to be distinct nations with distinct languages and distinct cultures. It's right there in the book of Genesis where when humanity gets a different idea and decides to try to merge all of the world's population into one people who believe the same thing and speak the same language and intermix and intermarry, he harshly rebukes his creation by destroying their idea and destroying the Tower of Babel that they were building in manifestation of it. 1 Timothy 5 harshly chastises those who would put foreigners above their own kin, above their own countrymen. And as for there being no Greek or Jew, no man or woman, no slave or free man, this is in reference to the spiritual. We know this because creation, the other place in addition to Scripture where God reveals the truth, very clearly contains all of these categories and they are distinct. And though they may enjoy a sort of spiritual autonomy that allows them to transcend the demographic characteristics of the accident of their births, it doesn't entitle them to go wherever they want over the objections of anyone who might get in their way. It is there to remind humanity that God gave Jesus Christ to forgive all of their sins, the sins of all of humanity, so long as humanity accepts the gift. But it is not some sort of political prescription. Before I turn to the other major subject that I want to talk about that will then allow us to tie this subject and the next one together so that we may be confounded by how things look in the current year. It's worth noting that whites are more atheistic and less theistic, less likely to believe in God than non-whites are, specifically than blacks and Hispanics and American Indians are. Asians are a different story. But to avoid the racial confounding that comes from comparing people by their belief in God, when belief in God tends to correlate with immigration restrictionism, while those who tend to believe in God tend to be non-white, and being non-white tends to, instead of correlating with immigration restrictionism, instead correlates with a support for increasing immigration into the United States. In other words, while those who believe in God are much more restrictionist on immigration than those who don't, the real magnitude of that difference is obscured somewhat by race. If we just look at whites, we have atheists at plus 7.1, agnostics at negative 16.1, uncertain believers at negative 43.7, and firm believers at negative 66.5. So the gap between atheists and firm believers for the entire population is 59.3 points. But when only whites are assessed, it grows to 73.4. So add to the point about immigration restrictionism being strongest among theistically serious evangelicals, add to that they are white evangelicals. The other thing we're going to look at are views of Israel by religious denomination, religious affiliation in the United States. From a Pew Research survey from last month, from April of 2025, the net favorability ratings of the country of Israel among Americans of various religious persuasions. And this is calculated by simply taking the percentages who have a favorable view of Israel and subtracting from that the percentages who have an unfavorable view of Israel. Not surprisingly, by far the most positively inclined towards Israel are Jews, coming in at plus 46. Next are Protestants at plus 17, followed by Catholics at negative 8, those without any religious affiliation at negative 41, and finally Muslims at negative 62. Just as there is a big difference between mainline Protestants and evangelicals on the question of immigration into the United States, there is similarly a big difference between how white evangelical Protestants and white mainline Protestants look at Israel. White evangelical Protestants come out with a net favorability for Israel that is exactly the same as Jews. Funny enough, it is a plus 46, while for mainline Protestants, it is a negative 3. And so mainline Protestants are about as favorably, or in this case, disfavorably inclined towards Israel as Catholics are, while evangelicals are as supportive of Israel as Jews in America are, or at least white evangelicals. That is how Pew reported it. It broke down grouped Protestants as a whole, and then from there broke Protestants down into white evangelicals and white mainline Protestants, but didn't discuss in further detail non-white Protestants of the evangelical or mainline bent. Turning now to YouGov, we'll look at how Americans feel about Israel by race. While Pew Research simply asked respondents if they had a favorable or unfavorable view of Israel, this YouGov survey item asks respondents if they have more sympathy with the Israelis or with the Palestinians in the conflict in the Middle East there. And the figures by race I'll give here are arrived at by taking the percentages who sympathize more with the Israelis and subtracting from that the percentages who sympathize more with the Palestinians. So a positive value here indicates net sympathies with Israel, and a negative value, a net sympathy with the Palestinians. Whites have a net preference for Israel of 19 points. And that is in stark contrast to all three of the non-white racial categories that YouGov asked about. Blacks have a +3 preference for Israel. Hispanics have a +5 preference for Israel, and others, primarily meaning Asians, a net preference for Israel of +4. So Hispanics +5, Asians +4, blacks +3, close to even in all three of those cases. And then whites +19, a preference premium that's 6 times as pronounced as the very modest, mild sympathy and preference for Israel over the Palestinians that non-white Americans have. Perhaps you're seeing where I'm going with this now, with the important caveats about how even Jews, who are generally regarded as being supportive of increasing immigration into the United States, as being a driving cultural force behind the push to liberalize America's and the Western world more generally immigration policies, with the understanding that even among the average Jew in America, immigration is something more Jews want to see reduced than want to see increased. Elite Jewish organizations, of which AIPAC is the most well-known, and for good reason, given how much influence AIPAC has on the political and cultural American landscape. Elite Jewish forces like AIPAC simultaneously strongly support Israel and have their sympathies with the Israelis clearly over the Palestinians, while also having been historically fervently supportive of increased immigration into the United States, and have not hesitated at all to to employ comparisons of any sort of contemporary immigration restrictionist sentiment with Nazism and Hitler reincarnate. And it's not as though these elite Jewish organizations are unaware of the hostility that non-whites and non-Christians, especially non-Protestants, and especially non-evangelical Christians, have towards Israel. Another elite Jewish organization that is pro-immigration and pro-Israel, the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, going all the way back to 2002, so a generation ago, more than 2 decades ago, the ADL released a report entitled A Survey of Anti-Semitism in America. And in the press release announcing that survey, the ADL wrote that one of the most significant and fastest growing segments of the American population, Hispanics, there exists an extraordinary gap between those born in the United States and those born abroad. The survey revealed that while 44% of foreign-born Hispanics hold, quote, hardcore anti-Semitic beliefs, unquote, just 20% of Hispanic Americans born in the U.S. do. And that same report finds that while 17% of all Americans held in 2002 what the ADL characterized as strongly anti-Semitic beliefs, 35% of Hispanics did, with 44% of foreign-born Hispanics holding such a position and 20% of native-born Hispanics. 35% of blacks in America holding strongly anti-Semitic beliefs, compared to just 12% of white Americans. So 12% of whites, according to the ADL, in 2002 were anti-Semitic, compared to 35% of Hispanics, with 44% of Hispanic immigrants and 35% of blacks. So 1 in 8 whites, but a staggering 1 in 3 of Hispanics and blacks. Not to mention Muslims, who in 2002 were a vanishingly small percentage of the American population. So small a percentage that the ADL didn't even cover Muslim Americans in this survey. But we can be assured that had the ADL done so, that the Muslim strongly anti-Semitic belief reading would dwarf that of even blacks and Hispanics. It would almost certainly be above 50%, probably approaching something like 80% of Muslims in America being identified by the ADL as anti-Semitic. As the Israeli assault on Gaza approaches the 2-year mark, pro-Israel Jews are finding out or being reminded that much of the world detests them for a menagerie of reasons, for economic and intellectual successes, for their religion, their culture, their clannishness and cultural proclivities, their perceived tendencies to dominate key industries like banking and finance and media, and also the culture. Not to mention the killings of tens of thousands of Palestinians and the displacement of hundreds of thousands or millions more. That much of the world detests them for this. But America, especially heritage America, especially flyover traditional America, does not despise them. And so it would seem, if for no other reason than purely out of self-interest, the Jews should adamantly work to preserve America's traditional ethnic makeup. It's an America that has supported Israel at great expense to itself. It's an America that continues to do so, even as more and more of the population of America resents and wants to see reverse that tendency. And yet, based on the ire and the disdain that groups like the ADL and AIPAC have shown heritage American, evangelical, flyover country Americans over the years, would lead someone who didn't know any better to think that the strident anti-Semitism that the ADL report from 25 years ago identified, that was, rather than being largely the purview of blacks and Hispanic immigrants, that instead it was the Southern Baptist Convention that really had it out for Jews. And so that's it. That's the bemusement that I opened the show talking about. If Jews have so much cultural influence in America, and if America's support is necessary for Israel's survival, and if Jewish elites in America are concerned with Israel's survival, All things that seem broadly true, and not even controversially so, as long as the right person is making the observation. Here, for example, is Norm Coleman, former senator and Jewish American, talking about exactly this, the relationship between powerful elite Jews and their ability to ensure that America continues to fund and back Israel. Coleman doesn't talk about the relationship between Heritage America and support for Israel, but he was a Republican congressman, a Republican senator from Minnesota, so he is a representative elected by Heritage Americans in flyover country.
In that war, when you think about it, the masters of the universe are Jews. We've got Altman and AI, we got Zuckerberg, we got Sergey Brin, we got the group across the board. Jan Combs, founded WhatsApp. It's us. And we have to figure out a way to win the digital battle.
Heritage America supports Israel. AIPAC supports Israel. But AIPAC doesn't support Heritage America. And now, as America's light fades, as American predominance disintegrates, as America is superseded by BRICS and the global South, Heritage America's ability to support Israel is going to continue to be diminished. And that is in no small part thanks to the demographic transformation that pro-Israel groups like the ADL and AIPAC have been leading the charge for. It brings to mind the Russian fable about the scorpion and the frog. The scorpion representing elite Jewish power, the frog, Heritage America, and the river being swam across, the well-being and the flourishing and even ultimately just the viability of the state of Israel. And if you're unfamiliar with the fable, here's a brief synopsis. A scorpion wants to cross a river, but he can't swim, so he asks a frog to carry him across. The frog, about to cross, hesitates, afraid that the scorpion might sting him. But the scorpion promises not to sting the frog, noting that if he stings the frog while the frog's swimming across the river and thereby causes the frog to drown, well, the scorpion's going to drown too because he can't swim. The frog considers this argument sensible and agrees to transport the scorpion across the river. But midway across, the scorpion stings the frog anyway, dooming them both. The dying frog asks the scorpion why it stung him, despite knowing the consequence, to which the scorpion replies, "I'm sorry, but I couldn't help myself. It's in my nature." And I guess I should correct myself there. The crossing of the river represents Israel's well-being. Israel isn't the river itself, but the ability to cross the river would reach the other side represents Israel's well-being and viability into the future. I don't have an answer to why this is what characterizes the Western political landscape in the current year, but it clearly does. There might be some indications with this merging of the MAGA movement with the Israeli First movement such that MAGA makes sense so long as Israel is considered the first or the 51st state. And so this elite insurgency of the Trump administration with people like Bill Ackman and Elon Musk and David Sachs, that this represents some sort of realization of what would presumably have been obvious for decades, and yet was still allowed by these putatively omniscient and omnipotent institutions of elite Jewish power. Of course, I say that flippantly, tongue-in-cheek, because of what we've spent this episode talking about. The protocols need some fixing if the elders of Zion are spending their time undercutting their greatest benefactor and most steadfast supporter, while having outmarriage rates of 50%, thereby diluting the Chosenite ethnicity that this whole endeavor was supposed to be for. And in addition to being as likely to marry Gentiles as they are to marry one another, also having fertility rates well below replacement. Any of these things taken singly and all of them taken together make the Kevin McDonald view of Jewish behavior as some sort of evolutionary strategy seem risible on its face to me. And yet I don't have any better explanation, just a series of observations. And that'll do it for me this week. Thanks for listening. We'll talk to you next time.